Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Farvolden, Executive Director of Mobility Network. And as we gather, of course, we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this event sponsored by Mobility Network at the School of Cities. Mobility Network is an institutional strategic initiative at the University of Toronto. U of T's institutional strategic initiatives address humanity's greatest challenges. Grand challenges demand a cross-disciplinary and collaborative approach between university researchers and their partners in government, industry, and the public. In Mobility Network's case, our starting point is the recognition that the sustainable, equitable, and efficient movement of people and goods is a regional, national, and global challenge. Our mission is to harness the incredible depth and breadth of U of T's researchers to induce transformational change in mobility services, usage, and impacts to affect significant positive societal change. We believe that U of T has a primary role to play in, first, understanding the complexity of the systemic and cross-cutting mobility challenges facing us, and then translating this understanding into positive and innovative change. You may know from past collaborations or events from UTRI, the University of Toronto Transportation Research Institute. We may have met before. Mobility Network intends to take these activities up several notches. We have assembled a group of 60 researchers from across U of T's 3 campuses whose diverse interests span the broad scope of critical issues about mobility and who will collectively advance the mobility agenda. As you know, transportation, I need to go back. As you know, transportation touches virtually all aspects of our lives. And we have named this panel discussion series The Way Forward, since it is the starting point of the journey in which we hope you will join Mobility Network as we explore paths toward sustainable and equitable mobility. Each session of The Way Forward is designed to address one of the factors critical to this journey. This afternoon, our topic for discussion is titled Leading the Way to Transportation Equity. And with this very brief introduction and somewhat stumbling, I'm pleased to return the podium over to our moderator, Professor Michael Widener. Michael.
Thank you, Judy, and welcome and good afternoon, everyone. This event is recorded just for your information. It will also be shared. I'm Michael Widener, as Judy mentioned. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Transportation and Health, an Associate Professor in Geography and Planning at U of T, and the Director of the Health Studies Program at University College. And I'm also the moderator of today's panel, Leading the Way to Transportation Equity. So today our 3 panelists will bring their perspectives to a discussion about making our cities across Canada more equitable places to live, work, and be well. Of course, there are many different dimensions that we could consider to do this, but policy planning and economic related factors that touch on mobility and transportation provide great potential for us to enact real change. So our panelists today are going to bring 3 distinct viewpoints on this topic, and we'll take a few minutes to share their remarks. After their remarks, we'll have a panel discussion followed by questions. If you have questions, please feel free to post them in the chat, and we'll try to get to all of those that we can during this workshop or panel, whatever it is. So I'll be introducing each of our panelists in turn, beginning with Heather Dorries. Professor Dorries will kick things off. Professor Dorries is an assistant professor in the Center for Indigenous Studies and the Department of Geography and Planning. Her research focuses on the dynamic interplay between resurgent Indigenous world-making and the violence of settler colonial urbanization. Today, she will provide us with her thinking around Indigenous mobility and how it can serve as a frame for understanding Indigenous worldviews and related impacts of colonialism. So with that, I'm happy to turn the microphone over to Heather.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm just going to get my slides. Great. Yeah, thanks for inviting me here today. I'm a bit of a newcomer to the world of transportation research, so it's exciting to be in conversation with all of you. My research sits at the intersection between Indigenous studies and planning. So what this means for most of my research is that rather than trying to understand Indigenous peoples as objects of research, so thinking about how Indigenous people might be affected by policy or research processes, I like to begin my research by thinking about how Indigenous knowledge systems might inform research processes. So what might Indigenous thought and knowledge tell us about mobility in this case? So when I'm starting this research on mobility and on transportation and on Indigenous peoples, I've been thinking a lot about how Indigenous peoples and Indigenous scholars have been talking about and writing about the question of mobility. And I think Indigenous mobility is a useful frame for understanding Indigenous worldviews as well as the impacts of colonialism. I think when people think about Indigenous peoples and mobility, the idea of nomadism might come to mind. And I think this is a common trope, but it's not entirely correct. I think the idea of nomadism often implies, in popular understanding, simply being in motion and moving around. But what Indigenous scholars and thinkers tell us about motion is that it's a really integral way of thinking about relations to the natural world, which in turn underlies systems of governance, understandings of sovereignty, and it is also something that is reflected in social and cultural practices. So Indigenous scholar Gerald Visener describes transmotion as continuous sovereignty or the natural right of motion. So it's gesturing towards a political status rather than simply a state of being in motion. So what this means is, from this perspective, is that when we think about motion and struggles for transportation, that these are also struggles for personal and community sovereignty. And I just want to say something about this, painting that I've included in the slide. This is a painting by the Dene painter Alex Janvier. It's called Morning Star. And when he talks about this painting, he talks about the morning star as a guide or means of finding direction as people move throughout the day. And so movement is a really important part of how he is conveying meaning in this painting. So onto the research. I was recently part of a knowledge synthesis project that was spearheaded by my colleague Orly Lenovsky at the University of Manitoba, and Charlene Simpson collaborated as well from Carleton University. One of the things that we wanted to understand through this knowledge synthesis project was how equity-seeking and equity-deserving groups in Canada experience public transit. So this includes Indigenous peoples, people experiencing disability, LGBTQ people, people experiencing poverty, people experiencing homelessness, etc. And this is a report that's available on the website pretty easily. I think we're going to circulate a link to this research. My role in this research was really focusing on the lived experiences of Indigenous peoples with transit. Just gone too far here. Right. I don't want to dwell on the findings, because I think in many of the ways the findings of that research were not that terribly surprising, unfortunately. One of the main things we found was that Indigenous peoples experience numerous constraints on their freedom of movement when it comes to accessing public transit. And there were numerous barriers that Indigenous peoples experienced, and a lot of these barriers were the same barriers that other communities face when accessing transit. These barriers include things like affordability, lack of service, issues of safety, including experiences of racism and violence while using transit, and particularly for Indigenous peoples and racialized communities, being over-ticketed and targeted by transit enforcement officers is a major deterrent to using transit. But there were a couple of experiences that we found were particular to Indigenous peoples and communities. One major issue that was raised in the literature was the lack of regional transit between First Nations communities and cities, and particularly in Western Canada, where Greyhound has ceased operating already several years ago. This is a major contributor to people turning to hitchhiking, and it's been documented that this has contributed to the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women. The other thing that we found, and we heard this when we held roundtables with stakeholder groups, is that there's a real desire of people to access transit with dignity. And this describes the ability to easily access transit service without harassment or harm, and to fully reap the social, economic, and health benefits that access to transit normally confers. So the problems are well known. You know, one of the things we saw in the research is that the problems of accessing transit for Indigenous peoples and other equity deserving groups has been really well documented. So this is informing future research that I'm currently in the process of formulating. I think there are two themes that are going to motivate this research. The first is desire-based focus, of a desire-based focus rather than a damage-based approach. So we saw that a lot of the literature documenting the challenges faced by Indigenous peoples focused on, damage, focused on problems. And as Eve Tuck points out, this can have the effect of pathologizing communities or making problems seem naturally occurring within certain communities. What we also heard from stakeholders is that communities have concrete ideas about how problems might be solved, and it's important to focus on these, I think, in research. The problems have been well documented. Community solutions have not been documented or highlighted in the same kinds of ways. So I think new research should definitely focus on Indigenous-led initiatives. A couple of these kinds of initiatives that come to mind are new paratransit service that's being operated in the Kahnawake Mohawk community outside of Montreal. There are also several new First Nations operated bus lines filling the gap left by Greyhound. And finally, there's new bus services being operated in cooperation between First Nations and municipalities. So one that I hope to take a closer look at is the new bus service being jointly operated by Curve Lake First Nation and the city of Peterborough that's operating transit between the urban center and reserve. So I think these are exciting and important developments that can inform not just transit planning in Indigenous communities and for Indigenous people, but I think could shed a lot of light on how other equity seeking groups might access transit in the future. So I'll conclude there. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Dorries. We're going to move to the next speaker. If you have any questions, please remember to write them in the chat. So our next speaker is Professor Angelina Grigoryeva, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. Her research examines the economic lives of households with a focus on both between and within household inequalities. She examines how gender and race shape economic activity, including both paid and unpaid labor. Today, Angelina is going to talk about how financialization and mortgages relate to transportation equity with a bit of a focus on debt. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I'm going to share my screen. Could you please let me know maybe in the chat if you can see my screen?
We see your screen, but it's in not in presentation mode.
Okay. Just a second. Sorry. Sorry about that. You should be able to see it in the presentation.
It looks good.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much to the organizers and the audience for joining us today. It is really a pleasure to be here today. So in my presentation, I will place the focus on transportation equity within the context of broader socioeconomic trends of recent decades. So what I will do is I will start with a discussion of this large-scale socioeconomic shifts, and then I will discuss the implications for transportation equity and inequity. So this is a Ford F-Series car. It continues to be one of the best-selling cars in Canada, in the United States, and globally. And if you Google for a list of best-selling cars worldwide, here you can see that many of them are made by Ford. Despite these successes, Ford Motor Company, this quintessential manufacturing company, derives most of its profits not through selling cars, but through selling financial products associated with car sales, such as car loans, as well as through financial operations not related to car sales at all. And so Ford exemplifies the fundamental transformation of the economy from manufacturing and service production to a finance-based capitalism. So since the 1980s, the economy has undergone a large-scale reorientation towards finance, thus marking a fundamental discontinuity from a post-war period characterized by industrial production and trade of goods. So in the past, the economy shifted. Think about it this way. In the past, the economy evolved and shifted from an agrarian economy to a manufacturing-based economy, to a post-industrial economy, and more recently to a finance-based capitalism. And so here on the slide, you can see trends in various indicators of this shift of financialization for Canada and for the United States. And what we can see here is that on these various indicators, financial activity became an increasingly important source of profit generation in the economy. And notably, the trend continued even after the 2008 financial crisis. So we now live in a fundamentally different economy defined by finance-based capitalism, where financial activity dominates the economy. And of course, this large-scale shift has also reshaped household financial lives. So as part of this transformation, households became increasingly involved in financial markets, and especially in the credit market. So here on the slide, you can see trends in the ratio of debt to disposable income for Canadian households since 1990 and until 2018. So the ratio of household debt to disposable income is a common measure of household leverage. So it captures how much households owe relative to how much income they have. And so what we see here is a striking increase over the past 3 decades. The ratio more than doubled. From around 0.8 to almost 1.8 during this period. So what might be surprising is that Canada is actually quite distinct in this trend of growing household indebtedness compared to the United States. So in the United States, what we see is that household debt increased sharply until 2008, and then the trend reversed, what we can see here on the slide. In contrast, in Canada, household debt continued to increase throughout this period. So Canadian households are now more indebted, significantly more indebted than their American counterparts. What's important is that most of the change that you can see here on the slide is driven by mortgages. So for the United States, most of the increase and then decrease in household debt is driven by mortgage loans. And similarly for Canada as well, most of this striking growth in household indebtedness in Canada is driven by mortgages. So mortgages are important because they enable access to home ownership. So in this new finance-based economy, credit represents a valuable resource because it enables investments that would not be feasible otherwise, such as housing or even education. So the chart here on the slide, on the left-hand side, shows that the vast majority of all home sales are actually funded by debt. So here on the slide, the sources of debt are divided in conventional private mortgages, which account for almost 73% of home sales, and federally sponsored debt, this is FHA and VA, which together account for 21% of home sales. So overall, almost all 94% of all new home sales are funded by debt. And mortgages are important because they enable access to home ownership, and home ownership in turn is important because it shapes access to neighborhood infrastructure, including schools, financial institutions, consumer marketplaces, amenities, and most importantly for our panel today, transportation. So we live in a society where access to transportation and transportation equity and inequity are very much place-based, and they are shaped by credit and debt. However, the distribution of household debt is highly unequal and it is highly stratified. So here on the slide, you can see the distribution of household residential debt by income percentile groups. So let me guide you through the slide. So what we do here is we divide all American families, and the data here is based on the US survey of consumer finances, but the patterns are very similar for Canada as well. So what we do here is we divide all American families based on their position on the income distribution, and we divide them in the top 10% families, like meaning families in the top 10% of the income distribution, the next 10% of the distribution, and then the remaining families are divided evenly into 4 groups. So we're looking at the top 10 families, the next 10% of the income distribution, and then the remaining families are divided equally into 4 groups. So what we see here is that the top 20% of households captured almost half of all residential debt in the past 3 decades. So the top 20% families are represented by the 2 light gray areas on the top of the graph. It's right here, this is the top 10% families, and here is the next 10% of the distribution. And we can see that the division is like, they really capture, these top 20% families really capture almost half of total household mortgage debt. Now, let me turn to vehicle debt, because obviously vehicle debt has very important implications for transportation equity. And again, the graph presents the distribution of household vehicle debt by income percentile groups. So the income groups are the same as in the previous slide. And so here, what I want you to look at is actually not the top 20% families, but the bottom 20% families. And they are represented by this, by the bottom shaded black area on the graph. And so what we see here is that the bottom 20% households captured only 5% of all vehicle debt in the past 3 decades. Right, so these are really striking inequalities, right? When it comes to mortgage debt, which is very important for transportation equity, we see that top 20% of families captured half of all household mortgage debt. And when it comes to vehicle debt, which again has tremendous implications for transportation inequality, we see that in contrast, bottom 20% families captured only 5% of all household vehicle debt. And so these trends are pretty robust over the past 30 years, and these are really, really striking inequalities. So let me turn to some takeaways. What we observed over the past 30 decades is a shift to a new finance-based economy, where we increasingly rely on credit and debt for the social provision of goods, including access to transportation. However, the distribution of this valuable economic resource, the distribution of credit and debt, remains highly stratified and highly unequal, and it actually privileges the already more advantaged. It privileges more advantaged higher income families, with important implications for transportation inequity. So thank you very much, and I'm going to stop here.
Great, thank you very much. That was very interesting. Well, finally, last but not least, we have Professor Steve Farber, who will now turn on his camera, I hope, and share his screen. Professor Farber is an associate professor in the Department of Human Geography at the University of Toronto. Professor Farber is an accomplished transportation geographer and spatial analyst who's published widely on the topics of equity and urban transportation. He's also currently the PI of the SHIRK Partnership Project Mobilizing Justice. Today, Steve's going to talk about how academics, government, and the public think about transportation equity generally, and then dive into the different ways transportation policy can develop to address inequities from bottom up and top down directions. So with that, please take it away, Steve.
Thanks, Michael. Can I just confirm that the slides look okay and the voice is coming? Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks for the previous two presenters as well. I'm going to take a bit of a step back, as I tend to do when we start a talk like this, and try to define the term transportation equity. And I'm always looking for new definitions, and I found this one at midnight last night, and I even though I was exhausted, I still think this is a good one. It's very comprehensive. So take a second to read that through. I hope it's big enough. And I really like this definition for its for how comprehensive it is, and I think most people would get something out of it if they read it. There's some terms in here, but a little bit of jargon, but I think it makes a lot of sense. But as a scholar or an academic who's been obsessing with this concept over the last few years, maybe decades now, I wanted to just highlight that there's some huge underlying questions that we can ask about the words in this definition. And the first one, probably the most complicated one, is what is a fair distribution? How fair should the transportation system be? What should our goals be in terms of fairness or equity in the transportation system? Massive question, actually, theoretical or empirical. What resources matter when we're talking about the distribution? Are we talking about vehicles, transit passes, bicycles? In an era of rising gas prices, are we talking about fuel and energy resources? Of course, there's the perennial question of how should we be measuring the benefits and costs of the transportation system? Many of us have been advocating for an accessibility-based measurement of benefits, but there's no consensus here when it comes to equity, how we should be measuring benefits or costs. And I'm skipping over a few of my questions because it's boring to just ask you questions, but another big one for me is which population groups should we be thinking about and why? Should we be borrowing definitions of these distribution groups from the United States, where some of this is codified in civil rights legislation, or what should we be doing within a Canadian context? Canada has its own history of marginalization of different population groups, and it has our own current conditions of marginalization or different levels of service being provided to different groups. And how do we go about figuring out which population groups matter and why? So yes, a simple definition, but you can see that an academic can start to make a career for themselves trying to pick apart, for better or worse, all of these things that are baked into a definition like this. I don't want to, I'm going to shift gears just a bit because my talk today is really about a bit of a tension that exists that I've been observing in the transportation planning space, especially when we're talking about planning for transportation equity. And this is a tension that exists between more technocratic and top-down approaches to planning for transportation versus more community-oriented and bottom-up approaches. And these are quick kind of thoughts that I've jotted down. It's not a manifesto by any means, but I'm thinking about top-down approaches generally motivated by utilitarian doctrines of trying to do what's best for society overall, leading to kind of regional scale performance indicators that rely on large data sets, on planning tools and models to forecast the impacts of transportation on society, and often dealing with people as aggregates and averages, thinking about, yes, we do this for equity, thinking about aggregates and averages for different population groups, but seldom are we in the space from top-down planning thinking about individual level outcomes. And I want to juxtapose that against bottom-up approaches or community-oriented approaches to transportation planning, which don't really drive their motivations from utilitarianism, but rather think about people's capabilities and the barriers and constraints that different residents face when trying to use the transportation system, or as is often the case, the results of them not being able to be mobile at all. And these are, here we're thinking more about the individual level outcomes. Could a person get to a medical appointment? Could they find employment? Could they keep a job? Could they visit their grandmother? And less reliant on big data sets, tools, and models, and much more reliant on stories and narratives about people's needs and experiences, and less focused on aggregates and average outcomes, and instead trying to recognize individuals and the intersectional characteristics that each of us embody that make us unique and complex and quite difficult to know how well we're serving all of us individuals, given our complexities and intersections. And I see this tension out there. I see it in research, and I see it certainly in practice. But they don't really, I've drawn these as silos. So we've got the top-down technocrats in a silo and the bottom-up community planners. And this extends to researchers who are doing research in support of these different modalities, right, of planning. And we have interactions. We're iterating or interacting silos. And I think you can think about this as, top-down plans get put forward, response by community criticisms, maybe the planners adjust to some degree to meet the needs of the community planners and so on. And I see this iteration occurring. It's not a very smooth interaction, and it's not necessarily built into the processes all that well. And it's quite questionable about whether or not continuing on in this way actually will lead to the structural changes and the practice changes that we'll need to reach higher levels of equity in the transportation system. I'm quite dubious that this is the best way forward. And I kind of think about how do we meet in the middle with all of this. And when thinking about mobilizing justice, which I'll briefly introduce next, a lot of what we're doing with mobilizing justice is trying to bridge this, I hate to use this word, fancy words, but this epistemological gap about what kind of evidence we're going to use to understand the world, and also a fairly baked in theoretical gaps that underpin our assumptions about what transportation systems are for and who they're supposed to be serving, and what justice, who's currently underserved and what do they deserve from a justice perspective, in terms of eliminating the gaps between different population groups. So I'm putting our name, Mobilizing Justice, in the middle here, but not to claim that we own this space at all, just that as our project is 1 year old now, I'm really starting to see more and more just how this is really one of the grand challenges of our initiative overall, in bridging this gap, and how do we meet in the middle. And it's not just questions in my presentation, I have some advice too. But I think that it's just so important that technocrats and community planners are top down and bottom up, that we need to convene and we need to jointly redefine what success means when it comes to transportation planning, and therefore redefine our key performance indicators that are used to assess our transportation projects. And it can't be done by enlightened technocrats like myself, it really needs to be done in partnership with the community. And speaking to my second point, that I've come to understand that the community really are the experts when it comes to injustices and better understanding their transportation situation, and hearing from them about what they think the changes are that they need, and looking at what they're advocating for. But to this point, I think it's super important that the technocrats out there, me included, wholeheartedly value qualitative research, narratives, lived experiences of equity-seeking people when it comes to understanding their transportation experience. But at the same time, we need to use those experiences not just to motivate our work, but also to think about how we should be changing our work. And one of the ways that we can change our work while still maintaining some of the benefits associated with a technocratic approach is to collect different data, and collect data, new types of data, and develop new types of tools and models that help us address more about what we're hearing from the ground up. And we need all sorts of research into how we should be doing that, and how we should be using research to better set our transportation goals, targets, and evaluation metrics. And I do think that there's, in the way forward, in a time of rapid change, of technological change, in a time of potential policy innovation in the transportation space as the world adopts around us, these are things that could potentially really benefit equity-seeking groups. But it's really, really important that we start putting their needs first when considering the implementation of new technologies and policies, and not letting the technology and the hype get ahead of us. We end up spinning a lot of wheels that don't really address problems, and we have to start with a problem-based approach to applying innovation. And that's also something that we can do at the university very well in terms of pilots and evaluation of new ideas in partnership with community. So I see a lot of ways to start bringing the top down and the bottom up together. And a lot of this sounds like the motivation behind Mobilizing Justice, which is a 5-year partnership multidisciplinary, multi-sector. I'm looking at the audience. Many of you are part of our project already or have been at our events. But it is a great opportunity and a privilege for us to be working together across these disciplinary and sectoral divisions, and I hope finding a way that we can meet in the middle and achieve more just outcomes for more people when it comes to the transportation space. So thanks very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you very much, Steve. Excellent presentation, and I really want to thank all three of our presenters for their excellent brief talks here. So before we kick it over to the audience for questions, I wanted to pose a few things to you all around your various presentations. And I think I'll start with one thing, connecting some of the ideas Heather put forward with those that Steve did. I'm wondering, Heather, about your views around what roles, if any, a top-down framing for transportation equity might play, especially as it relates to indigenous mobility. And so I'm thinking specifically about the desire-based approach that you mentioned at the end of your talk. I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah, I guess I don't think that top-down approaches are always inherently bad. When I think about top-down approaches, I think often about centralized decision-making, coordination of planning, doing things that it's very difficult for smaller groups of people to do. I think the problem with a lot of the types of top-down approaches that Steve was talking about is that they tend to depoliticize the challenges and the impacts of the decisions that are being made. And what I mean by that is that they tend to ignore the differential impacts and benefits that different communities might experience as a result of making those decisions. So I think that the meeting in the middle, is an important part of this approach. And I think the question is, how do you start to inform those processes so that they are more equitable? And I think that's what the Mobilizing Justice project is all about. Transportation problems, as far as I can tell, I'm relatively new to this area of research, but they're complicated questions. We're often talking about moving large numbers of people over large distances. These are, I think, questions that benefit to some extent by, I don't know. I don't even know if top-down is the right terminology, but it needs coordination. There needs to be coordination of planning and policy there. So I think it's more a question of how do the methods get politicized, right? And remember, help us, people making those decisions, to remember and involve the people who are going to be most affected by the decisions. Yeah,
it's an interesting point to thinking around the politics of coordination, because that coordination, as you mentioned, is so key to these large-scale issues. So, okay, well, thank you. Another question then, sticking with this framing of top-down, bottom-up, that Steve had mentioned for you, Angelina, is I was wondering what you think the role of financial policy and regulation and how it's developed and coordinated, as Heather put it, how that might play a role in improving transportation equity.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think that's a very important question, and I do think in general, what we know is that the trend of financialization and growing household indebtedness, it started in the 1980s, maybe even as early as the late 1970s. But when it comes to policies that would address inequalities in financial markets, we really saw most of the action following the 2008 financial crisis, which served as a wake-up call for policymakers and also for researchers. So think about it this way. The trend started in the 1980s, but there was not a lot of policy interventions that would specifically target inequities and inequalities in credit, in financial markets, in the credit market, and with implications for transportation inequity since the trend started in the 1980s and until 2008. So there is definitely a lot more that could be done and a lot more that should be done. And I think that there will be progress on this side. So there is just, as of now, not a lot, I would say, that we can talk about. There is some growing attention to policy-making efforts, but keep in mind that even in Canada, in the United States, in Canada even more than in the United States, the financial sector has been quite deregulated. So we haven't seen that many policy interventions as could have been done.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. I guess my last sort of moderator question then to the group is around temporal scales or urgency as it relates to all of these matters. And so thinking through the different framings that you all brought forward and the different dimensions that impact transportation equity, we're dealing with rapidly changing urban structures. We are very behind on building infrastructure in cities like Toronto. And so given that there is some level of urgency in connecting communities, so for example, with Greyhound going away in more rural parts of Ontario, for example, the subway that's just now being built in downtown Toronto, the Ontario line, and won't be ready for another decade if we're lucky. How can you reconcile the sort of need to consult and coordinate with communities from the bottom up with the need for speed to get some of these things done? I'll just let whoever wants to speak to that speak to it. I don't have an answer, but I'd be curious about your thoughts.
Sure. I guess what I would say about that is what's clear, based on the research that I've been involved in, is that, yeah, these are really important questions. They're not just questions about convenience or comfort, but really are questions of life and death, which should underscore the importance of involving communities who will be most dramatically affected by the outcomes that transit can produce.
And yeah, and my experience is either both for researchers and practitioners, doing some of that consultation and working with community and thinking about bottom-up approaches. It's just the time is never right and the money's never there to do it. And I've just seen that in my own work. I'm very guilty of this as well, of having just that very crucial consultation and collaboration, grassroots collaboration, just falling out of the schedule and budget. And you know what? I would be lying if I said that when we conceptualized mobilizing justice, that we knew exactly how much money we were going to have and how much time and effort we were going to put into doing just that in a whole project that's more or less the raison d'etre is to create the space for this to happen, in a meaningful way. And even then, we didn't necessarily get it right at the beginning. We're continuing to work on it. So so crucially important that we make the time and we spend the resources that are required to do that. And there are things that we can do in practice that we know will work that are faster to deliver, like investing in buses and other types of low cost and more rapid delivery stopgaps that we can be investing in as we make sure that we get our super expensive mega projects like the Ontario line and everything else right. And we've not been doing things as well as we could.
And Angelina, would you like a last word on that point before we turn it over to the audience for questions?
I think I fully agree with both Heather and Stephen on that. Community involvement is really important when we want to understand how households borrow, what kind of financial institutions they can access, and how they make financial choices, which then in turn have implications for mortgages, for vehicle loans, and so on. I do think it's really important to connect to communities. Fully agree here. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, we have about 8 minutes or a few less for questions. If there are questions from the audience, please feel free to type them in the chat. We have a question here from Patrick asking Angelina, if I'll just read it out loud for the recording. Could you speak to the availability of car alternatives as it relates to equity implications from the car debt numbers that you shared? Presumably, the availability of convenient transit or other alternatives would impact whether or not it's necessary for people to take on the debt of financing a car. Which I'll just add, I think there's also a point there for more rural communities, communities that aren't necessarily in urban centers too.
Absolutely. I do think that, let me just quickly read the question. I do think that when we think about, growing household involvement in financial markets, specifically in the credit market, and its implications for transportation equity, I think there are two ways to think about it. One way to think about it is to focus on car loans, but that's just part of the picture. Another part of the coin, I think, is looking at mortgages, because mortgages essentially shape access to the housing market, which in turn shape access to these alternatives forms of transportation, such as public transportation, right? So I think that even if we think about the alternatives, car alternatives, still financial markets are very, very important, because for so many people, access to car alternatives is shaped indirectly by financial markets through access to home ownership and mortgages. I hope I was able to communicate it in a comprehensive way. But basically what I'm trying to say, it's not just about car loans, but it's also about mortgage loans when we think about access to transportation and car alternatives. But thank you so much. That's a really good question.
Anyone else want to touch on that question at all, or we can?
I just think that there's so many interesting ways to dissect the role of car ownership and transportation equity and it's of course it's very context dependent, and it's also very time dependent, like to Michael's previous question about what about the scale of time that we're thinking about. And if it's going to take 15 years or 35 years to provide an alternative to get around in Toronto suburbs, how long should we be asking people to ride the bus, and investing in transit rather than trying to help people improve their mobility using other modes of transportation that are available and that the system is designed for today? Of course, there's, it's such a complicated question because of it. You don't want counter countervailing policies. You don't want to be supporting car ownership for the poor while also building transit and spending money on it. You want our policies to align. That what is a huge question is like, what is the space for increasing automobility in car deficit households in the near term? And I think that's an urban question. It's an everywhere question, really, where we don't have good alternatives to the car right now.
Yeah, interesting. Other questions from the audience? One here from Matt. So Matt says, a few examples were mentioned already, but does anybody on the panel have additional examples of plans, programs, or policies that are informed by process that explicitly center desires or aspirations?
I know of some exercises in the transportation space where different kind of transit alignments were compared against their ability to meet the needs of a large survey of respondents on like what types of destinations people felt they wanted more access to. And then they went and they tested different transit alignments in their ability to actually meet those stated needs from a very large survey of residents along the potential corridors. So that happened in Spain. It's very time consuming and very expensive to do that kind of work. But we need to test such things out in more serious ways in order to know if they'll help us achieve better outcomes.
Any other thoughts on that question? Okay, well, I think because we're only a few minutes out from the end of the panel, I want to wrap things up here. I want to thank Heather, Angelina, and Steve again for their time and their really interesting perspectives. So if you could give them a round of virtual applause, we can see the little clappy icons, and that'll make them all feel good, I think. So thank you all again for your time, and I'm going to turn it over to Judy to give you a little bit more information about the next panel the Mobility Network will be hosting. So thanks everyone, and see you later.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Thanks to our panelists and thanks to everybody here for joining us. And we hope that we'll see you again. Before you leave, please tell us how you did by completing the survey that Pat's going to share and posting any comments you have in the chat. And we'll take a look at those later. We'd really, really appreciate your feedback. This was the third in a series of sessions exploring the way forward. We'll be back in 2 weeks for getting mobility to net zero. And every 2 weeks after that, for discussions on important topics in mobility. Registration is open for all remaining sessions. You'll find these advertised on the UTRI website, utri.utoronto.ca, and you'll get reminders if you subscribe to our weekly newsletter, which you can also do on the website. And you can always find out more by contacting us. And thank you again very much to everybody for this, really thought-provoking session. So look forward to your feedback and look forward to seeing you again. Thanks so much.